So it's clear that there is a constituency in the neoconservative Zionist military-industrial complex that is advocating and pushing for isolation and war against Iran. But if I was advising the Iranians, I would say, look, it's very clear the American people do not want this. They've never wanted it. Trump may have shot himself in the foot and destroyed his hopes of re-election by doing this, but at the same time, the Democrats are no alternative. They've engaged in some of the most heinous wars. They are not candidates for peace. So how is this going to be played out? Well, if I was on Iran's side, I would not be lured into kinetic counterstrikes that can justify U.S. tit-for-tat operations. That's what the warmongers want. They want Iran to begin to react, or they want to plant false flags that make it look like Iran is reacting. Instead, Iran has to take the higher diplomatic world public relations route and say, we're looking now for all nations to step in and act. The days for talking are over. And I think you see that by many of the world's leaders scrambling to de-escalate the situation. As Zarif has reported, and I've been following him very, very closely, the world is scrambling to de-escalate this, to calm things down, to recognize this has the potential of spinning out of control, similar to the World War I situation where you had the death of the Archduke, I think it was in Yugoslavia or Serbia, that quickly escalated and brought in the Russians and the French and the Germans and the British into the worst war, World War I. The same thing could very easily trigger another war, War III, by bringing in the Russians and the Chinese to the defense of Iran, as well as Iraq. And if pride and hubris enters in, you could see the Israelis and the U.S. and the British and the Saudi Arabians engaging in a very violent war that spreads and could be, probably the worst and the most damaging in the history of civilization. So we don't want to go that way. And how is that best handled? Well, it has to be handled in a way that the U.S. is forbidden and stopped from any further missile strikes or assassinations or engagements against Iran or Iraq. So the Iraqi-Iranian state or growth or brotherhood, if you want to call it, needs to protect itself and bring in China and Russia as perhaps the underwriters of that peace, and it set up a new power dynamic and communicate to the rest of the world. Iran and Iraq and Russia and China represent the new stability in this region, and the U.S. has represented instability since 2001. And it's clear that they want to steal the oil from Syria. They want to steal the oil from parts of Iraq. But those days are over, and we are changing that dynamic. And President Trump should honor his original promises to pull the United States out of the Middle East, to pull us out of these endless wars, and to perhaps use this as an opportunity to do it. So we have to look for where can we maximize the political gain? Where can we develop diplomatic opportunities and leverage points that are going to benefit growing a more peaceful, stabilized region. And I think Zarif and the other leaders can use this martyrdom of Soleimani to make him larger in death than he was in life. Say, what would Soleimani want? What would he want the people of Iran and Iraq and his Shia brothers to do and follow? He would want them to live and to be more prosperous and safe and stable. He wanted Iran to be recognized and embraced by the rest of the world, and he wanted to free Iran from the strangling sanctions that were being illegally put against it. So this is an opportunity. By Soleimani's sacrifice, he can be the instrument for liberating Iran and deepening its connections and deepening the reciprocity that other nations should be showing. Soleimani, in honor of him, the Russians should be providing Iran with S-400 missile systems. The Chinese should be providing naval ships to do escorting in the Persian Gulf. And other nations should also be welcoming ambassadors and diplomatic connections and economic connections. And the U.S. sanctions should be completely thrown out altogether because of this action. So we have to look at what are the opportunities for political and economic and diplomatic leverage so that military kinetic wars and tit for tat could be avoided.
And Richard, I'd like to get your take on that. How Donald Trump's actions and his decision to carry out this assassination in any way protects the lives of U.S. forces and U.S. troops stationed in the Middle East?
No, of course it doesn't. In fact, it exposes them, and they're very exposed in a number of countries. They're exposed in Afghanistan, they're exposed in Syria, they're exposed in Iraq. There's a completely false narrative that's going on that somehow General Soleimani was responsible for the deaths of hundreds, maybe thousands of U.S. soldiers. That is a false narrative. And it was not very long ago that General Soleimani was, and their forces in Iraq were fighting against were struggling against the ISIS forces in that country. And so we have, that's the reality of what the situation has been. But for the U.S., it's always, what have you done for the U.S. leaders? It's what have you done for us lately? And the Trump administration obviously has moved in the direction, and Trump promised extreme hostility toward Iran. Even when he was running, he called for dismantling the JCPOA and for reinstating economic sanctions, which really prevented, even before he was elected, a normalization of economic relations inside of Iran, or Iran's relations with the world. I think that we have to keep this in mind, is that Trump is an extremely unpredictable and an extremely impulsive individual. It doesn't mean he's not part of the system. He, of course, is. But now he's got the people who are putting the words into his ears are Brian Hook and Mike Pompeo and these extreme anti-Iranian figures. And at the same time, we have to recall that Trump himself has said, and I don't want to be overly alarmist, but I think we have to recall this, is that what do we have nuclear weapons for if we don't use them? And so I think we can't rule out the possibility of if there was a response, if there were to be a response from Iran, or maybe not a response, maybe just something, another fabrication, that the most awesome weaponry, the most horrible weaponry could come into play. And again, I want to say, I'm only saying this, I'm very cautious about saying things like this in general, but I think that the situation is a grave situation. It's a very dangerous situation. And it really, there was a U.S. Marine, a former U.S. Marine who was at our demonstration today in San Francisco, Ryan Miller, and he's quoted on the CBS News as saying, when are the people of the United States going to wake up and come out of their houses and demand an end to this? And we could see today the potential for that in the streets of San Francisco. The great response that there was to a demonstration of a couple thousand people organized on short notice, as I mentioned, but thousands of people along the way agreeing with us that they don't want another war. But simply wanting or not wanting, or public opinion polls, doesn't matter. People have to take action. And now is the time to take action and demand that we not see a new all-out war in the Middle East, and one which, as Answer has said, could have the gravest conceivable consequences. We have to take very seriously what's going on in Washington, what's going on in the White House and the Pentagon right now. It really poses an extreme danger to the people of Iran and Iraq, first and foremost, but really to the people of the world, including the people of the United States.
And Scott, Donald Trump blasted George Bush for unfounded allegations with respect to WMDs, for picking a fight with Iraq, going in there, annihilating the country, and after trillions of dollars in a 17-year occupation and invasion. Here we are now. He's on pretty much unfound allegations. He says he has shown no one proof that the late Commander Qasem Soleimani was going to carry out an imminent attack on U.S. forces that he says he needed to thwart. That's why he carried out this assassination. He's shown no one proof. So he's doing exactly what George Bush did, unfounded allegations, basically on the precipice of starting a war.
Well, you're right, and I'm always taken back when I hear the lies and the nervous stutterings from the imbeciles that surround Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, Gina Haspel, Esper, these neocon Zionist personalities that are very, very incompetent, dull-witted individuals. Insecure in their own manhood. I think that represents a very powerful opportunity for the Iranians to speak very gently and quietly and directly to President Trump and say with a confidence and a smile, look into their eyes and you will see that your own advisors are lying to you. Your other guest, Mr. Becker, gave a great point on how the narrative that the Iranian Soleimani had been murdering thousands of Americans is completely false. I saw this when I had my time in the military, and the Zionist Mossad were impersonating Arabs and killing American troops, and that was a great betrayal, similar to the USS Liberty. But it makes sense because that is their objective. That was Netanyahu's objective, was the ode to the non-Israeli expansion plan. But I think Donald Trump, for his lack of experience in government, his certain degree of insecurity, his vanity, and his lack of sophistication and education, those are things that I've said before. The Iranians need to look at him as a toddler or a child or almost an imbecile when it comes to diplomatic sophistication and world events and affairs. A man who's perhaps the captain of a ship but has no idea how to drive it. And that's where true statesmen and leadership and blessed, heavenly inspired wise men would come to him and speak to him, if not in person, then through back channels, and say, your people are lying to you that are surrounding you in the State Department and the CIA and the military in different intelligence gathering capacities. They are reinforcing a narrative that's based on lies that are going to, number one, result in the deaths of thousands and tens of thousands of Americans potentially, and possibly have you killed as president as a war criminal, and your family as well. That's always an area of interest and concern to the president, is his children and grandchildren. Where will his legacy lead them? Into being hated and reviled among all U.S. presidents, or seen as a deliverer who removes the sword of war from the Americans' hands and develops it into at least a balance of toleration? The American people are not going to tolerate war with Iran. They've had 20 years of war. They've discovered after 5 to 10 years the first war was based entirely on lies. The great 9/11 event that was used to trigger the war was actually an orchestrated false flag attack designed with the CIA, the Mossad, the Israelis, and the Saudis combined. The scientific evidence alone confirms all of that. But yet the mainstream media, which has a stranglehold and has lobotomized the American society, they maintain this very limited access to truth. So that's really, I think, where Press TV is one of the strongest players, an advocate to truth, a loudspeaker for truth, a light in the darkness that the American public are slowly beginning to gain access to. So this is a time to bring truth directly to the president, to speak it. I think Zarif's announcements on Twitter and his recognition that there is a, quote, pathological handicap in America is very accurate. America is suffering a civil war with a variety of false narratives that have been presented over the past coming year. And I think you also have to have a society unparalleled in the evolution of man in history, that is suffering chronically from the disintegration of families, for sexual confusion, homosexuality, transgenderism. All of these social decays and corrosives and perversions have been infecting American society and culture and entertainment and education, to the point where you have a very sick society and nation that is naturally manifesting these sort of abhorrent behaviors and international violence. So in one sense, you do not necessarily want to enter into a grappling match with a society like that. You do want to sort of block and redirect its blows away from you, and that's the wiser way for Iran to exist and to continue. It does not want to enter into a full-scale war with the U.S., much as that would be very desirable to Israel and the Zionists, but that is to be avoided. And to avoid that, Iran needs to leverage its political resources with Russia and China and other nations to create a siege mentality, a defensive mentality, and at the same time being the first to be making direct communication to the world that be prepared for additional false flag attacks to be blamed on the Iranians, such as ships, American ships perhaps, being sunk in the Persian Gulf, or more Saudi Arabian oil fields being attacked and being blamed on Iran, or Israeli Mossad agents repeating the Charlie Hebdo type of attacks where they pretend to kill and shoot up clubs and things like that. We're entering a time where those who propagate war are going to be so desperate that they are going to be engaging in a lot of attacks, probably in America as well as Europe, trying to blame it on Iran. And Iran needs to be fully prepared to defend itself and to show the world that these sort of behaviors are just consistent with the deformity and the insanity that the U.S. has slowly been infecting itself with. I think we're recognizing a rise in a new paradigm of political power, and that is Iran, Russia, and China in the Middle East, with Iraq. Now that Iraq has been waged war upon once again and its sovereignty violated, I think we're recognizing a whole new rise of these nations. So it's a time to be very, very cautious and delicate, and not allow traps to trigger tit-for-tat military kinetic violence and actions. But this is also a time for Iran to cash in on the promises that the Europe and the Russians have made to them.
I want you to hold your thought, if you could, both Scott Bennett and Richard Becker. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to sign off, and I want both of you gentlemen to stay on. You're going to continue in a couple of minutes after a short break with my dear colleague, Arash Zaidi. That's a wrap for me. And for our viewers that have been joining us for this extended coverage here on Press TV, we're live here in the Tehran studios of Press TV with this extended coverage on the aftermath and funeral procession for late Lieutenant General of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, Lieutenant General Qasem Soleimani, and Deputy Head of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Units, Abu al-Mahdi al-Mohandes, which were the procession has traveled from Baghdad to Karbala to Najaf, and those are all in Iraq. Now, both gentlemen, along with their entourage, were assassinated by U.S. drone strike just outside the Baghdad International Airport early Friday morning. That's roughly about 85-90 hours ago. We've been covering it since here. The aftermath, the tensions, the rise, the threats back and forth, and we will continue to cover it here on Press TV. That's it for me. There's going to be a Joe Biden soundbite, and after you'll be coming back with Arash Zaidi. So Scott and Richard, hold on a second. Goodbye for me, and thanks for sharing with us. And viewers, we'll be right back. Stay tuned.
He was a senior figure of the Iranian government, and there's no doubt that Iran will in fact respond. Indeed, they've already vowed vengeance. This is and was an enormous escalation, and it follows a string of dubious actions that President Trump has taken that have drastically increased the prospects and the risk of war with Iran and danger to Americans. The question is, do Donald Trump and his administration have a strategy for what comes next? Have they thought through and planned for a wide range of retaliatory and asymmetric actions that will almost certainly see from Iran in the near term? In Iraq, militants may target our embassy again, our diplomats, and American civilians. Other than telling Americans to get out, what is the administration's plan to protect them? How are we shoring up our embassy and preparing for evacuations? What is our plan?
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Press TV live coverage of the aftermath of General Qasem Soleimani's martyrdom at the hands of the U.S. forces that came in the early hours of Friday. Press TV, since its very early hours, has started a rolling coverage of whatever has to do with the martyrdom of the ex-commander of the IRGC Quds Force, General Qasem Soleimani, that was assassinated in a terrorist attack that happened near Baghdad's international airport, as I mentioned, in the early hours of Friday. As you can see, we keep showing you breaking news of the reactions mostly that come in from here and there, including this one that you have on your screens at the moment. That's from one of the Iranian generals, General Mahidi, who has actually said the Americans, Israelis, must await Iran's painful response and powerful revenge. That is something that has reverberated as soon as the attack happened. One of the most famous reactions, I would say, from most of the Iranian officials, including leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. Of course, Press TV gives you analytical insight into the whole matter as well through the contributions that we receive from our esteemed guests who give us their precious times from all over the world. At this moment, I have Mr. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer from San Francisco. I will also be speaking to Mr. Richard Becker with Answer Coalition, also via Skype from San Francisco. I would like to begin this part with Mr. Becker, if he can hear me, from San Francisco, to basically and give us actually some reaction regarding what and how he perceives this matter to be for the viewers of this hour of Press TV. Mr. Becker, if you hear me, please come in and give us your reaction to begin with to this whole incident. If we have Mr. Becker, please. Well, I wish I was told we don't have Mr. Becker anymore with us. Instead, I'm going to go to Honorable Mr. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer. Mr. Scott Bennett, the hour has changed, and you're with us live in another edition of our live coverage. For the viewers of this hour, I'd like you to come in and basically give us your reaction to this whole incident to begin with.
Well, I think it's understandable that the Iranian people and political and religious and media circles are outraged and offended and hurt by an act of war being levied against it. This is what the American people would feel if a highly respected general or military figure or political figure had been assassinated. This certainly opens up a military potentiality for conflict between Iran and the United States, and I think that's the last thing that would be beneficial for either country. So it warrants looking into what are the diplomatic, what are the communication, what are the political and economic actions that can be taken to stabilize the situation. And I think Iran is in a very good position to use the sacrifice of Soleimani as a bridge and a license and an opportunity to demand that the rest of the world put its moral character into action and to fulfill the promises that the rest of the world and various nations have been very effective at talking about, but we've seen very little action. Look at the JCPOA, for example. I think one of the most stupid things that has happened was that the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA because of the Zionist influence on President Trump, and we've seen the other Zionist influence by transferring the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. We've seen the giving of the Golan Heights over to the Israeli Zionists, all of which are in violation of international law. And I think the Zionists have been actively engaging in a deception campaign against the president and have given him nothing but lies and misinformation and bad intelligence that has provoked him to take this action. Perhaps they've done it with the lie that this would have no effect and that it would be instantly forgotten. And the president foolishly listened to them and engaged in this activity in assassinating Soleimani. And it has had the reverse. It has had one of the most destabilizing, globally outrageous expressions of public outrage ever. And I think the president is now in a very nervous situation and trying desperately to understand how to back out of this. And perhaps that's an opportunity for the Iranians to engage directly to the president through Russia, an intermediator or interlocutor, and say, we are not here to be enslaved or brutalized by the Americans, and we certainly do not seek a war or a violent relationship with the American people, but now is the time to talk to one another as equals and engage in dialogue and diplomacy that will settle the grievances, that will allow for a peaceful coexistence between Iran and the United States, and use Soleimani's sacrifice as the bridge for doing that. I think Russia and China need to put their money where their mouth is and provide Iran with the military systems to defend itself, ships and missiles and everything in between that's required, agreements of mutual defense, because otherwise it can be said that it is only a matter of time before Iran would suffer the same fate as Iraq. And it would suffer it because of the lies that the Zionists have propagandized. That's how they started the first war, was with the lies of weapons of mass destruction, the triggering of 9/11, all of which were Zionist, Mossad, CIA operations. So I think this is a replay of that tired old deception, but the world is wiser now, and Iran has an opportunity to directly engage the world, engage Europe, engage Russia, China, and say, we are not going to be defined as a violent, angry, emotionally unstable country or people. Quite the contrary. Iran, the Persian people, our culture, our warrior ethos commands us to conduct ourselves with sophistication and calculation, and we are now going to maximize our diplomatic success and victory and influence the world and isolate and remove the United States, and effectively our revenge will be eliminating the U.S. ability to wage future wars in the future by isolating it with its own insanity and its own actions. And I think Iran needs to speak directly to the president and tell him, your people are lying to you, they're creating false narratives, pure propaganda, and unless you wake up and you recognize that you are not being told the truth, you're going to be forever poisoned by lies, and your people are going to remove you as president in 2020. The Democrats have no plan and no capability, and they have no morality whatsoever, but yet they have essentially been given a great gift by this action by President Trump, because now they can try and portray themselves to the American people as the peacemakers, which they are not, but it will work against the president. So this is a very delicate time. It's a very foolish thing that was done. But at the same time, we have to look, how do we use this and move forward in a stabilizing way where a sense of diplomatic victory can be acquired and military destruction avoided. And always be wary of the false flags that no doubt the Israelis will be launching at this very moment to try and blame on Iran.
Now, one thing that shouldn't be forgotten, Mr. Bennett, is the fact that it was not only the Iranian commander, as you know, who unfortunately lost his life in that terrorist attack. The other prominent figure to have lost his life is Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, an Iraqi figure, of course, with the PMU, and right now, as I imagine you also are totally aware of this, the Iraqi parliament, at least so far as I've understood, two Iraqi parliament factions, two of the largest ones, have agreed on drawing up laws to basically expel the U.S. forces from the country, and it seems right now under such circumstances it is totally justified, no matter how much influence and no matter how much profit, if we're to believe there was any profit for the Iraqis out of the U.S. presence there, is involved in that.
Well, I think that's a very astute and accurate and prophetic indicator. There will be a vote in Iraq to expel all U.S. persons from the country entirely, all political persons, all military persons, all academics perhaps. Although, let me say, I think now is a time for academic conferences and discussions where writers and thinkers and people of genuine truth and moral character still need to come together and discuss these things. And I think Press TV does a wonderful job in helping do that. We need thinking people to come together. So I would always encourage conferences and discussions where good men of good character can come together and see the solutions, so that the politicians can't corrupt us into a following degradation. But I would say, too, that the Iraqi people and the Iraqi parliament and culture can very easily remove the United States and say you have 3 days to remove every piece of U.S. person and technology and paper and whatever else, and then send the Iraqi people with bulldozers, shovels, and sledgehammers to deconstruct that great behemoth U.S. embassy and make it a very big symbolic gesture of cleansing Iraq of that memory, of that history, of that violence, of that subjugation and enslavement which the U.S. Embassy represents. The U.S. Embassy, saddens me to say, does not represent anything of culture or advancement or sophistication or enlightenment or mutual coexistence as much as I would like it to. The U.S. Embassy currently, ever since George W. Bush and onward, has represented sort of a ball and chain or a neck shackle around the Iraqis. And this action gives them the license to say no more. The U.S. Embassy is going to be deconstructed in a peaceful way, but a legal way. The Iraqis are not going to bomb it or fire missiles at it. Quite the contrary. The Iraqis, in a civilian parade of peaceful construction workers, if you will, are going, and with their own hands, with their own sweat and blood and time, the Iraqi people are removing the U.S. Embassy from their memory. And other nations could follow suit. I think there is a global campaign underway to demonstrate outside the U.S. embassies to say what you've done to Iraq and Iran, the rest of the world will not tolerate. And that is really the way to influence the American public, by showing them that the rest of the world stands with the countries of freedom and stands against the bullies and the oppressors and the tyrants and the warmongers. And I think that's something that should follow. So I would recommend that all things be done in a diplomatic, peaceful way, so that the war profiteers, the military-industrial complex, the Zionists cannot be given the excuse to engage in kinetic, violent military operations and try and turn Iran or Iraq into a chaotic situation. We want stability and order, and the best way to do that is through diplomacy and communications.
Speaking of diplomacy, we have some reaction coming in from Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. Let's just take you there and take a listen to him.
This was an open act of terrorism and also a cowardly act. They were not able to confront Major Soleimani, and they had to martyr him in this way, the same method they used for martyring Moghnieh and Mousavi. So this is the method that coward Americans use. They use the method of state terrorism. The Americans in the past years have imposed economic terrorism against our nation, an economic war, and it's been beyond a war, it's been an act of economic terrorism. They have also added state terrorism. First of all, we should see how the Americans were entrapped and ensnared for just conducting this dangerous action and cause problems for themselves. Our feeling is that the Americans made a miscalculation, and there were improper consultations and advices given to by some reactionary regimes. These advices were given to the Americans and also the Zionist regime. So that's been a dangerous starting move by the Americans. At the same time, this move by the Americans was a cowardly terrorist action. So the vehicle carrying Major Soleimani and Abu Mohandes was targeted by a chopper or a drone.
Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif speaking there. I am at the moment speaking to Mr. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer. Mr. Bennett, it seems to me that according to what Iran's foreign minister was saying, this is a method that has been practiced by West-sponsored terrorism in the killings that they have actually committed before. And it seems to me that maybe once and for all they should have received a proper response to that. Do you think the assassination of General Soleimani would be the trigger to that?
Well, it certainly could be. I think that Mr. Zarif is accurate when he says the Americans were entrapped in this. They were lured into this. That's a very accurate assessment, because it is the Israelis and the Zionists and the Mossad and their false intelligence that they provide through their own dual Israeli personnel in government, in the State Department, in the CIA, who I know personally and I've seen them in action. There's a very great stranglehold on the American government, not the people of America, but the government of America is strangled by a Zionist influence that produces false intelligence and goads and lures the United States government and the military into these sort of actions. And the president is a victim of it. And I'm not trying to make excuses for him. He is the commander-in-chief. But he is surrounded by these bad intelligence advisors, giving him bad intelligence, giving him lies, and this sort of provocation is the result. So how is it counterbalanced? Truth and influence and communication is the way to counterbalance lies. So there really has to be an aggressive communication effort by the Iranians directly into the heart of the American president, and that comes from multidimensional influences. That means that the Chinese need to communicate the Iranian position to the president, the Russians need to communicate the Iranian position to the president, the Europeans need to communicate directly to the president, and the lies that the Zionists put forth need to be exposed and dried up and evaporated by the truth. such as the truth that Soleimani has not killed thousands of Americans. The Israelis have, of course, and pretending that many of the attacks were done by the Iranians and the Iraqis and al-Nusra. It was in fact done by Mossad. That sort of revelation needs to be made more and more apparent. There needs to be direct communication to the American people and the interests of the American people to say directly to the president, your people elected you for peace and stability. After 20 years of war, they were tired of the bloodshed, they were tired of the lies, and you promised them to escape that. You promised them to remove the United States from expending all of its treasure and its young men on these fruitless wars of bloodshed. And yet now you're being made a hypocrite and a liar, and you're betraying your own soul by following the instructions of liars who really now have put you into a trap that you will be expelled from the presidency in 8 months if you do not immediately change course and hire new people in your cabinet. I think that's the great lesson right now, is the American president needs to eliminate and remove, I would say, 75% of the people in his cabinet. Remove them entirely and put new people in, such as Senator Dick Black, who I know personally, who is an outstanding thinker and military person and legal mind and diplomat. He's a senator in Virginia, and he's been to Syria. He knows Iran. People like myself and others. The president needs more counsel from balanced, intelligent people who've worn the military uniform and know what war is, and also diplomacy, because he currently has a cabinet full of liars, fools, and warmongers who are interested in money and profit in the military-industrial complex. So President Trump needs to remove a lot of these people from his cabinet in order to begin a new 2020, a new phase of diplomacy and not war. That's the only thing that will guarantee his election, is if this war with Iran is not blossomed into a full-scale mushroom cloud of violence, fire, and death. And Iran can help settle that and stabilize it in a way that saves face, in a way that actually achieves a lot of the diplomatic, economic missions that the Iranian government and religious regime and people want. So this may be God's way of opening up an opportunity and a gift, albeit through the sacrifice of Soleimani, but this could be a way to open up a direct channel to the president and influence him in a way that they could never do before, and also demand the expression of support and defense and gratitude from Russia and China towards Iran, so that in the next 10 to 20 years you will see the Iranian, Russian, Chinese collaboration grow into a way that really produces more stability and safety from the world than we've seen in the last 100 years.
Thank you very much. That's Mr. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer, via Skype out of San Francisco. I appreciate your time, sir.